Welcome here from the pyramid of Enver Hoxha. And this is now very much under reconstruction. It will be some kind of high-tech center. And this was the place, the pyramid, where actually he should have been buried. Yeah? In 85 he died. It was similar like Stalin's funeral. His intention was to be buried here, but his successor, I think in the 80s, he really was not having it, and he was buried at the other main funeral place. And there was this symbol left. Nobody really knew what to do with it. And imagine how big it is. It was a very big building, and it was important to understand that this country was one of the poorest countries in the world already in 85 when he died. But years before, in a country of complete poverty, complete depression, economic development of the level of the 1950s. In 85 I'm talking, in 85 the West was already winning the Cold War almost, and we were quite rich, and it was the computer age already, and here they were living at the level of the 1940s, maybe late 1940s, yeah. And they had 1,500 cars, trucks, vehicles, everything, buses united, yeah. And this was a country, you can say, beautiful of bicycling, but it was a country of the low level of civilization, technical mechanization was very limited, poverty, and of complete suppression. And then he built this kind of monster building for himself, yeah. Yeah, and this is a terrible sin. And one of his many, because it was one of the most terrible regimes in European history, maybe in global history. This kind of paranoid form of complete suppression, building the country basically like a gigantic concentration camp. Yeah? Concentration camp in the sense that it was a closed country. Yeah? Nobody could leave. Leaving it was a death penalty. Yeah? And also then punishment for the whole family in internation camps. And that's for 44 years. Yeah, it was a tremendous crime which was committed against the Albanian people, and it's great that communism fell in Albania. In this video I will talk about the fall of communism. It happened basically in two major incidents. I have talked already. It happened late, what has to be understood. It happened late, it happened confused. It was a bungled transition, and that's also why we today have many issues in Albania. And this needs to be also discussed, clarified and worked upon. And what we in Austria and Germany call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coping with the past, is also very necessary here in this country. And to get on terms with the tragic past of communism is only partially happening. And what is then the problem? Of course, the whole toxic conflict between the parties is related that every family is either on that side or on that side. They were part of the state, and the children now, or the grandchildren, are now running the country, and there's others are politically prosecuted families who were part of that. They were not part of the society economy. They were basically farmers or in internment camps, yeah, because that was the division in this terrible 44 years of the communists. Yeah. So how it fell? On the 2nd of July in 1990, there was the first one when the crash into the German embassy. A truck driver, he opened the embassy, people rushing in. You imagine this, more famous is the Prague embassy, refugee crisis in the Czech Republic. In the summer 1 year before. This was basically, they heard about it. They tried also, because the only way to escape, the borders were hermetically closed. You were killed when you went there. So they had to crash into the embassy, and one of the truck drivers, he crashed into the German embassy wall, cracked a bit open, the people rushed, and then there were 5,000 people. And that was the major first sign Albania is cracking up. And then in December, there was the student revolution, which then toppled the communist system. And it's important, it was not, it was first of all much later. We are talking about 1990 now, yeah. So it was quite late, yeah. It was much later than in Central and Eastern Europe. It was 91, I think, yeah, exactly. I know I make a mistake from time to time. I have to see the timelines. 2nd July 1990, the embassy, and then it was 91 only the real transition, because the elections were then of Berisha to president in in March 92. So I'm correct? I think I'm correct, yeah? Yes, absolutely. Now I got the timeline right. Yes, messy. And it was messy start. And it took a long time and it fell late. And it is now what I want to explain is why it happened so late. Why the Albanian communism was much harder than in Yugoslavia or in Eastern Europe. Why it was more problematic. What is the reason for that? Because it's a combination of reasons. In the personality of Enver Hoxha, it's a combination in the relation with Yugoslavia, the big neighbor over there. I told you already, the embassy of Serbia very much in the center. The embassy of Russia. Imagine always when I say Russia and Serbia, I mean also Yugoslavia and Soviet Union in the past, in that past of Enver Hoxha. Obviously that is to be understood. And also it's necessary to understand that the fall was messy, then delayed, and that is to this day a major issue. I've explained it. How to explain it best? Maybe with the start why communism came to Albania in the beginning. It was not an intrinsic kind of idea, but it was part of the Tito partisan resistance struggle when in the Balkans, in the fight against, when the Italians, there was the Nazi Germany, Italy obviously, Italy then was defeated, the Germans took over the positions of the Italians, and then also the question for the British was what to do with Albania in a way as well, because the British were the most active in the Balkans. They were making the decision to support the Tito partisans and not the Chetniks. The famous mission of Alistair MacLean and of Churchill saying, who kills more Germans gets more support. And then it was absolutely the more effective force was obviously the Tito partisans. They got all the supplies from the Adriatic route. In the book of MacLean, it's very well described how the decisions went and when the supply routes came. First also the airdrops into Bosnia, and then obviously also the airdrops into the southern positions from 43 on 44. Decision then was what to do with Albania. Obviously here the much stronger resistance against the Italian was from the so-called Bali Kombeta. This was the king's forces, if you want, or the normal resistance fighters. Yeah, the most of the people, they were basically just they were just guerrillas for freedom. You know, this was not so ideological. That was you can call it the old regime prior, or most of the landowners and the people themselves. Yeah, it was less ideological. It was not the Albanian fascist side or so, as this is now totally misrepresentation. But the question was, and how this was decided, was ultimately that Tito was the key player here in contact with the British. He had the access to the information, to the logistics, to the supply, to the money, to the real victory tools, the tools for victory. And obviously he was the most important player internationally. And he had this vision of a Balkan federation. And obviously also Albania, as the backdoor to Yugoslavia, needed to be part of that. Also, he wanted a kind of multi-ethnic state, as he then tried after 64 in that sense, maybe or maybe not. In Albania, obviously, you know, this idea was very unpopular to be part of Yugoslavia. Understand it very clearly. They had undergone already to the first genocide in 1878 and the years after. They have gone already for the second genocide in 1912 and the years after, to 15, and they knew already what will be their destiny as either in the best case second-class citizens, in the worst case genocide. So that was very unpopular, but Enver Hoxha was then in the moment not the decision maker. He was basically placed by Tito's agent in the Albanian communist movement. They killed the leader before, or removed him. Enver Hoxha seems to have been compliant. He was put in charge by Tito for the Albanian communists to be then part or integrate the country. The best sign to prove this is also he put the same 29th of November, which is the liberation day of of Yugoslavia against the Nazis. Yeah, he put that as the main day as well, in order to show Tito happy, come and parades, we liberated it together. Obviously, the real contribution of the Albanian communists to the liberation of Albania was minimal. And they were then very strong when they were put, and then they have changed the narrative and they have imprisoned all the Bali Kombeta. all the others organized fighters, they were contributing to the victory. They were obviously armed, they were obviously well organized, and they had to be interned. And that's the start of this huge suppressive regime, because so many of them were killed, and then so many of them and their families were suppressed. Basically, the whole country had to be subdued then after 44 November and later, because they were basically not part of the Albanian communist partisans. Very few were, in fact. And then that was the story of that one. And then on this lie, basically he based his whole power, and he based it obviously on the support of Yugoslavia, because logistically the Soviet Union is far. It's obviously only by air and by sea. And so Yugoslavia was from 44 to 48 the big power. But then there was the Greek Civil War, the Greek war between Britain and America on the one side, and the Greek government, and the communist takeover effort. And there was the big fight, how far to go, if the Yalta agreement should be held or not. Because Churchill has asked Stalin for Greece, and that was the compromise. The rest of the Balkans for the Soviets, and Greece was too important. Stalin was always thinking in these big terms, and so he said he will anyhow not win Greece completely, so don't mess up the things. And then came this Tito-Stalin split, and that was obviously the one opportunity for Enver Hoxha to save himself, because he saw the split coming. He decided to stick with Stalin and to be then independent and own actor in his own country. And so he went off with Stalin and stayed with Stalin until he died, 53. And then he was very critical to the post-Stalin, he called it revanchism. And that means all this Khrushchev kind of cleaning up of the Stalin mess. And then he was gradually moving closer to China until the full break, where it was going too far, that he actually killed one pregnant Politburo member who was executed, who was then part of and that was so far in 61, that was the 22nd Congress of the Soviet Union, when then Khrushchev said these Albanians, they are nuts, they are completely crazy, and he broke, then all the advisors had to go. And that was the period then from 56, the 20th Congress, to 61. 61, the complete break of the relations. And then obviously they moved ever closer to China, because that was the competing power, until the complete split with Sino-Soviet split in the wake of the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. And then this was this period then from 61, ever closer to China, and then from 69 completely close to China, like being Albania the mouthpiece of China in the world stage. That was the role basically of, that was also why Albania put the application for the UN membership of China. When the Americans opened to China again, it was Albania making the resolution, and they got some claim to fame on that level during that period. And so this whole links between Albania and China has started from this period when the Soviets withdrew, and because he was always on the most Stalinistic side. He tried to keep on the Stalin line, and when the Soviets changed, then he went to the Chinese, and when the Chinese changed in 78, when Deng Xiaoping opened China, and then he left the Chinese. So in the last years of his life, he was completely alone. That would have been good, if he would not have taken his whole country hostage as well. And it was a terrible time, because the 80s was already, I was alive in the 80s, I'm 53. The situation was in the 80s in Austria, it was already very decent, more or less. And here people lived on the conditions of the 1950s, and there was no support, because Albania, obviously very small country here, and very lack of technology, capital, human resources. It came all from the Soviet Union advisors. Once they had to go and were withdrawn completely, then the Chinese took over, and they built all the hydropower plants, the Elbasan chemical and steel factory, combinat, the railways, all industry that is left here to rot today. Some of it, most of it, the EU and the Americans had to rebuild and extensively and expensively, because it was at least something built, some basic stuff, and it will be generations still to come to get it to European standards, in terms of the railway infrastructure, to clean up the environmental legacy of the Chinese communism, which they have destroyed here. But this was at least this phase where the Chinese did some things for the energy, railway structure, and for some basic industries. That was the period, and then totally alone. And then he died, and then he built the pyramid before, because his people lived in the level of the 50s. And so basically that's the short version of the communist history. And then Alia came. He was also completely nuts, but then they had to somehow maneuver in a world which was changing, because it was the end of the confrontational phase of the Cold War. Gorbachev came, and they understood that they will be the only Stalinist place left out there in the Adriatic. And obviously the times were very complicated for them. They knew, and that's also, by the way, the story where all this drug trading to Italy started, because that was a state organized, the communist state of Albania from the 60s on, actually, has organized by its own institutions, by the customs institution, by the police, by the state companies. They have organized this because it was an important source of foreign income. They almost had nothing. They had no arms industry, no domestic arms industry to speak of. Their whole kind of Chinese built infrastructure things, they were producing more or less electricity for at home, nothing to export. Albania still is a net importer of energy to this day. And then you had a little of, you can export something of the mines from the concentration camps, from the slave labor camps system. They put that on the market, Honduras, and the chrome, the ferrium, and others, and some of the material, but that was not a lot. And then obviously it was tomatoes, melons, and whatever kind of high value, lucrative crop you can have. Obviously here under these climatic conditions, subtropical and a lot of water and good earth, and then comes obviously drugs into the game, and they exported significant amounts to Italy from the 60s onwards in order to have some foreign exchange in order to survive. And the system was a drug-pushing communist system of total suppression, which was a gigantic concentration camp. That's what this guy did actually here. A very terrible legacy, and obviously deeply traumatizing, because he was not only killing the people who were resistance against the Nazis and Italy, but not in the Communist Party. That was the first phase, obviously, and after the Victory Day in 44-45. But then he was permanently cleaning his own party. Cleaning meaning they had this one Communist Party member on the top level, pregnant, executed. His prime minister, Shehu, they killed in the government building during this meeting. He had this agreement. He was actually not about politics so much, because the story goes like this. He was his daughter, I think, no, his son of Shehu was somehow then having engagement, falling in love with one of the so-called familiar catch. This is very important to understand, You have familiar catch, that means you had some links to foreign countries. That's a bad family, Meaning you had either some links to foreign countries, like you were from a Greek minority, or you spoke Italian, or Serbian, or Macedonian, or something. You were from these border regions where there are older minorities. Or you were fighting in the resistance fighters with this Bali Kombeta, or you had some links with other foreigners. That was, in that case, I think the son of Shehu, he had the girlfriend, and he then married her. He imposed it. His father said, okay, it's your love. They were really in love. It was a Roma kind of this kind of Romeo and Juliet a la Albania. And then the situation was found out by the secret services, because here they had very strict secret service. And then it was a big story. They asked Shehu, you cannot marry the daughter of a regime critic or of a family, of a bad family, because that's not the way. We have the pure communism system here, and everybody who has family relation with the past, with the, in a way, opposition, the king, or the pre-government elites, in a sense, or the capitalist elites of the past, before in the 1930s and 20s, he must not be married, in a sense, because then they move up in this kind of pure caste of communist leaders. So he said no, and then they fought, and then they shot him. And the rumor goes they shot him in the meeting of the Council of Ministers, the president to the prime ministers. Okay, all of them, maybe I make some mistake, maybe some guys can correct me if it's not wrong, if it's not totally correct, yeah. But that's how I read it in the books, and correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, you have to imagine this level of craziness, yeah? And it's all connected to this one guy and his kind of grip to power. And let me also, maybe that was one anecdote I remember, but also the main thing is, if you were fleeing the republic, you were running away from Albania and you escaped, then whole your family was imprisoned in these internment camps. Internment camps you have either in the mountains, in the mines, to dig for chrome and die, or that was the spatch, I mentioned it already, or you have it in the swamps, in the seaside areas, where there was no infrastructure, no road, and then you basically lived under that condition, like permanently. I have a friend, I will also try to make an interview with him. He is, but many people of this generation speak only English, unfortunately, no, only Albanian, so it's difficult to make interviews in English. But I tell you the story. He lived in this swamp in Fier until 30, when communism fell. From 1960 born, 1930 you stay in the camp. It's not, to be correct also, it's not a concentration camp like Auschwitz, yeah? There's not mass killings with gas chambers in the sense, yeah. But you know, you are meant to stay there. You are guarded. You are blocked, yeah. You are living there. You live in the swamp hut. Your ability to move outside limited. No, doesn't exist, yeah. You stay there for your life, yeah. Because your grandfather was in the Bali-Komtar, or your uncle was not fighting with the communists, but with the other opposition groups, yeah. That is the way Albania was governed by Enver Hoxha. What other extreme stories I can say of your team? It was really very extreme, very low level of economic development, mechanization. I have told you this maximum of 1,500 cars in 1990. I told you about the internment camps, about Spatch, about the political imprisonment. Yeah, the children, you know that when you stole a potato on the field, you were the enemy of the people. Yeah, that is one story one friend told me. When I was now in the hospital, then a guy who was also in the hospital told me the story that about the actions, yeah, Aktionet, yeah. That was the idea, you know, everything which was built by basically slave labor. And slave labor, you cannot call it differently, because it was meant to call the people, but they were not called voluntarily, but they were called, in a way, that's our common action for the people. And then you had to go and you had to build these bunkers, you had to build some streets, yeah, but on an unpaid basis. So you were also 3 years in the military, I was told. 3 years obligatory in the military without payment. Then constantly being called for a non-paid work, hard work, yeah, like for the people. And if you criticized anything, you were an enemy of the people, amici populi. That is the idea, yeah. Doesn't matter what happened, you stole a potato, or you were talking badly about the regime, or you were marrying in a bad family, or you were basically thinking about leaving, or somebody in your family left. Very few people could leave actually, because it was very closely guarded. And so the situation was, and that then the people were imprisoned in that system, yeah. And that was basically the idea, that when you were listening also to foreign, because you could at the beach areas, you could listen to Yugoslavian or to Italian music, not on every day, but if you are there, you could, some people construct it, and in the border areas as well, to Greek music, to Greek radio, and to Yugoslavian radio, and to Italian. So you could build some kind of makeshift antenna, and you could listen. When you were caught, obviously, you were also imprisoned and punished as a people. Anyhow, I think you get the idea. It was really a very terrible regime, and it was a very specific form of terror, because contrary to Eastern Germany, they actually pretended to be civilized, and they also built computers. You know, obviously theirs were bigger than ours and worked less, but you know, they were at least trying to. They had also Stasi and all these terror instruments, and they committed also horrible crimes. But here they committed horrible crimes on the level of the 1950s, yeah, kind of technology, kept the people on that level, and also in complete poverty. And then they have additionally had this kind of paranoid projects, these bunkers and this kind of a low level of development. And it was pretty terrible to live here. Pretty terrible. It's no wonder that the people broke the embassy on the 2nd of July 90, or that then they later on this famous ship that is in the world news media when they ran all and many people drowned leaving to Italy, and it was like the most terrible regime of the world. It was a gigantic camp, internment camp. Maybe that's the best way to put it. And he was the guardian of that system. And he has here this pyramid. I was very critical to even keep that, but you know, you should at least have a museum part of it and not somehow keep the structure, because but some people again say keep the structure, keep the museum. I will wonder what it is ultimately, but it's forever a symbol of a most horrible regime. To my best knowledge, it's the worse than Ceausescu. He was also completely nuts. And it's one of the most terrible regimes in communist Europe. And people are deeply traumatized to this day because it was internally done by themselves. It's not in Kosovo. It was completely different. There's an ethnic divide. You know, there was a Yugoslavian ruling class making apartheid regime against the Albanians. So the Albanians were working together basically. Here, everybody was against everybody. One wrong word, internment camp. So they are really very careful what they say and what they do in order to see that. And to this day, obviously, much of the controversy and much of the cornering of the political market, and that's on both sides, of the Democrats and then the Socialists, is still connected to a very botched transition and to this terrible past. Because, you work basically along the ethnic divide, the political, and who was in the prison, who was the prison guard. This is the division line to this day, and their children and grandchildren. And because there was never any phase to really clarify these things or work with the crimes and get rid of them, and then you have the political divide to this day, and then everybody is abusing it. Berisha made his career basically accusing the others to be the prison guards, and and so everybody had to be with him because himself or his parents or her parents were on the prison, were the internua. And so this is the reason for the political divide all the time. And because there is no such a ideological divide, it's not such a, as we say, political parties, center right, center left. It's about taxation, about how big should be the state, about other kind of economic and social question, which is normally the party political divide. No, in these countries it is basically between the interned and the interners. That's unfortunately to this day. And then of course it has softened, and now it's already 30 years. But fundamentally 30 years is not a lot. It's just one generation of change. And we are still in this mess because of this guy and the geostrategic situation Albania found itself after the end of the Second World War, and the wish of Tito to integrate it into his bigger Yugoslavian project, not to be mixed up with bigger Serbia, though that is a different project of Milosevic. But this bigger Yugoslavia was obviously the strategic necessity also of Yugoslavia to have this backdoor under control. And basically that's the story of this terror regime in a nutshell. Yes, it's quite shocking, and it's very bad, and it will be overcome inside the European Union. Outside it will continue, but once there's clarity and the firm fundament, the euro, the membership, then all these deep-sitting traumata of the past, they can be overcome, and by time it will heal. As we have seen, also Germany can be a more normal country. Also my native Austria is now a normal country. Okay, not in NATO, that's something we should also change here. Albania has made that one because basically American leadership integrated it for strategic necessities, and there was George Bush president who did that and imposed it on everybody else, and that was a very good thing to do. Now we need similar leadership, because if we wait until Albania is a perfect country, it will maybe take another generation and maybe it will not work. Yeah? So that's a very clear statement of mine. It's much better to heal the wounds of the past inside the clarity of prosperity guaranteeing European Union structures, and then things will heal. But what we don't need is the old generation. We don't need the old generation sitting in the European Parliament, in the European Council and in the Commission. We need the guys with the past who to this day, you know, there are people who 30 years ago were Communist Party officials. Yeah? Worst of them, Kramus Rucci. Yeah? He was the Minister of Interior, Deputy Minister of Interior, was recently still the Parliament President. To this day. So this kind of guy, all out of the institutions, yeah? Everybody linked to the communist past, out of this institution. It's a different thing if your father or your grandfather, yeah. But you know, all the people directly, they must be now out 30 years later. It's scandalous that they were at all around, and this was creating this cleavage of the politics in Albania, which we don't see so much in the other countries in the Balkans. Yeah. There's other issues here and there. I can talk about it when I visit them. But that's my call now here. Enver Hoxha, a most terrible personality of horror, a cabinet with Stalin and with the other bad guys in one level, given that he is from a small country. He was basically abusing and extorting and killing so many people, torturing his nation for more than 1.5 generations, maybe 2 generations. It's a horror story. Good. Overcoming the horrors of the past, we can unite it in the European Union, and that's what we should do. Invite Albania to the European Union in 2024. Bye from Tirana.